Awesome. All right. So we'll just quickly introduce ourselves. And then Griffin, would be great just to hear a little introduction from you.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Chris is on the call as well. He'll join the video in a couple minutes here. My name is Ryan Bolles. I'm an MBA 2 at Stanford. I am also doing a master's joint program in environment and natural resources with a focus on clean energy. I'll hand over to Barrie.
Yeah, awesome. And I'm Barrie. I am also a second-year MBA and pursuing a master's in environment and resources. Pretty interested in cities, so really excited about learning about the blockchain and how this relates. And Griffin and Chris, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Griffin Haskins. At MOBI, my title formally says that I do partnerships, but I really wear quite a few different hats. I help talk to and onboard new companies and help engage with current members of MOBI. I'm also a fellow for multiple of the MOBI working groups, which we'll get into in just a second, into more detail there. In terms of my background, I am a little bit of a rivalry. I graduated from UC Berkeley back in 2019. There I was very involved with an organization called Blockchain at Berkeley. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but they're a blockchain student org over there, which is where I kind of got my start in like learned about blockchain and how it works. And yeah, after graduating, I came straight to MOBI, and it's been great so far. Thank you guys for having me. Chris, you wanna introduce yourself?
Hi, this is Chris Ballinger. I'm one of the founders and co-directors of MOBI. Before MOBI, a very long time ago, I was a monetary economist, and also a graduate student at Berkeley. Spent 20 years in what's now known as fintech and banking. Then became CFO of Toyota's largest subsidiary, and was also in charge of innovation. And about 2015, began thinking about and learning about blockchain in IoT networks and in connected devices, which got me really excited about the potential, not only for vehicles, but for distributed energy resources.
Thanks, Chris. And I guess kind of our first question, I'm sure you guys get this frequently, is kind of like a high level overview of what blockchain technology is. So maybe said differently, is how would you explain this to somebody at like a dinner party or somebody that doesn't have a technical background in it?
Yeah, I'm happy to give a brief overview. A blockchain is essentially in a sentence, a digital ledger of transactions that are recorded and duplicated across an entire network of computer systems that are called nodes that manage the blockchain. Essentially, it's a kind of a unique way of structuring a database such that you have you accumulate transactions into what we call blocks and create hash links between each block of transactions. And I'm going to skip, I'll skip all the technical stuff, but essentially what that does is it makes it so that if you want to go back and alter or change, a bit of data that was recorded onto the blockchain, that, 10 or 12 blocks ago, then that you're going to have to change all of those blocks all the way to the present, not just on one computer system, but across every computer system in the network, which is where you hear about blockchain being secure, or immutable is the term for that. There's a few kind of key properties, I'd say, just, outcomes that you get from using a blockchain. One, blockchains are programmable. You're able to write programs that are called smart contracts generally, but not always, and have them exist on chain, and the blockchain will execute that code. Due to this kind of hash linked kind of structure, it's secure. If desired, the identity of the participants, it can be either anonymous or pseudonymous. That's something that you may or may not want, depending on the use case. It's distributed. It's immutable. It's majority rules, maybe unanimous, as in unanimous or majority rules. as the way that blocks and new information is added onto the blockchain is via something called a consensus mechanism, where all of the nodes in the database all come to agreement as to what the next block should be and how how it should be added. Yeah, there's I mean, we can talk a little bit more about like the outcomes of this, but what it really does is it puts everyone on a level playing field. It allows organizations and entities to engage each other and share one system without any one of those entities having root access. And so that's why you hear a lot about it. So we use the term solving the trust problem or providing a trust layer, because when you utilize a blockchain to store information and data, you don't need to trust the owner or maintainer of that blockchain, just like you would need to trust the owner and maintainer of a central database. You don't need to trust, or the blockchain provides that trust in a sentence. It's kind of a general overview. Chris, is there anything that you thought I missed in there?
So unmuting. So no, that's a pretty good general overview. I think maybe to sum it up, nobody has privileged access to a root directory. And the blocks are linked. So the provenance of data is assured. It doesn't necessarily mean that the data on a chain is correct, but at least nobody has tampered with it since it was started. So if you trust the person who put it on, if you have a process that's trustworthy, then the provenance from that point on can be trusted, which is very important and very useful.
That's great. And a great segue as well. We were kind of hoping to talk a little bit about how this applies in smart cities. So maybe if there are some high level takeaways, do you see where do you see this technology playing its place in in the future smart cities?
Yeah, the key here is that blockchains allow anything, be it a small IoT device like a point sensor, to an actual piece of machinery, or larger device, to a vehicle, a phone, even individuals like people like me, or larger or organizations and companies like auto OEMs, to have an identity and to transact and share data within one shared network. And so what this means is that you're able to create what we call and what is called multi-party applications. You're able to develop new solutions and applications that connect all of these different parties to do just about anything that you can imagine. For example, within the EV space, blockchains would allow, say, the smooth and easy exchange and flow of battery data between chargers and electric vehicles, even if that charger and electric vehicle don't share a manufacturer, or if they don't ostensibly have any integration built between them. You can use blockchain in order to ensure that they are able to smoothly communicate, transact, share data, and execute the charging session. And there's a lot more use cases that, especially within smart city, but they all kind of center around this core of being able to give a unique, secure identity to people, things, and organizations, and have them interact and engage within multi-party applications.
So maybe I can add on that what makes a smart city smart is that the smart city is connected, it's decentralized, and it has some computing power and sensing power out there on the edge. And two of the most important components of that edge are energy and vehicles, right? Both things which create some of the biggest problems and have some of the biggest opportunities for improvement and better solutions in smart cities. Both of those networks are increasingly edge networks, in the sense that in energy, the resources are increasingly decentralized, right? We have small scale solar, we have small scale wind, we have neighborhood grid, we have batteries and cars. All of those are essentially decentralized edge energy resources. In mobility, the vehicle itself is moving around. It needs to operate very quickly with low latency for safety reasons. It's very hard to know which vehicle is what as they're moving around. So essentially an edge network. Blockchains are a marriage made in heaven for edge networks because they provide a ledger and they provide a trust and a connection between devices that allow devices to interact with other devices in smart ways very, very quickly.
Very cool. So you were sort of getting into it because you were talking about energy and vehicles, but would love to hear what is MOBI and how are you integrating blockchain into making that reality possible, and to making sure we can have a good eye on our energy sources and our vehicles and all of that.
Okay, so MOBI is a nonprofit organization. It's a group that was originally founded by about 35 members, many of the world's largest auto companies. It grew out of a lot of POCs that the auto companies were doing with distributed ledgers and blockchain, and the frustration that they had in finding that their POC was technically successful, but couldn't scale. And in hindsight, it was very clear why it failed to scale, and that is that blockchain is inherently a collaborative network. It's essentially a way for decentralized business partners who aren't related under the same organization to collaborate together in trusted ways. And so the key to scaling is putting together a large enough community. It's all about the community. There's a minimum viable community here, and it's pretty big. So MOBI's goal was to create this nonprofit entity to create that minimum viable community, to be able to create standards, ways of doing things, ways of giving identities to things in these edge networks that would advance the technology and allow these things to communicate, transact, share messages, share information in trusted ways. MOBI now is up to well over 100 members, including some of the world's largest companies, including large governments. The European Commission is a member of MOBI. The Ministry of Highway, the Research Institute of the Ministry of Highways and Communications in People's Republic of China is a member, and so on. It's a global organization in the sense that about a third of the members are in Asia, a third in Europe, and a third in the Americas. And we're working on creating these ways of communicating and standards to advance the technology.
Yeah, I figured I'll quickly jump in. The way that MOBI generally operates is by carrying out what we call working groups. Essentially, we go to our membership, and MOBI is entirely member driven. And when enough of our members all agree that there is a particular area within blockchain and mobility that they would like to investigate, research more, produce standards for, we will form a working group around it. Our first working group was the vehicle identity working group. We call it VID1. And that's because you need, as a kind of a base layer, you have to have identity. All applications rest on having an identity within that system and being able to reference it. So that's why for creating a digital identity for vehicles was MOBI's first focus. That VID working group was launched when MOBI began and released its first standard, the VID1 standard, in July 2019. We've since grown, as Chris said, we grew from 35 to 100 members. We also grew from 1 to, I think, 7 working groups now. We have a vehicle identity working group that is now in its second phase. So there's kind of 2 working groups. We have, of course, we've discussed the electric vehicle and grid integration working group, the connected mobility and data markets working group, a supply chain working group, and a working group focused on finance, securitization, and smart contracts.
Very cool. And Yuko, do you want to just jump in with your question?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just curious, how big or small is the minimum viable size for these to happen?
So when you say minimum viable size, we don't know what the minimum viable size is for a blockchain community. I would say MOBI is one of the first and most successful of our type of industry organizations working on this, but there are others in the insurance industry, in the IoT device industry, in the telecom industry, and so on. And in some ways, we're finding that there's a lot to collaborate on, and we're finding that we're reaching out to these other blockchain communities, other business automation networks, and other industries, and building some of the core architecture with them as well.
Yeah, I also think that it's important to keep in mind that it's not necessarily binary, right? It's not like you have beneath a certain amount of members or companies involved, and then you can't reach scale. And if you get even just to that point, then you're good to go. It exists on a spectrum. Even if we just had, let's say, 2 automakers, right? Only 2 OEMs, then we would be able to do some applications. Like there would be some uses for the blockchain in that case. Around kind of breaking down each of those companies' individual data silos and being able to ensure that they're able to communicate, share data, and handle any processes or applications that require them both to communicate. And there is value there. It's just that it's not all of what MOBI has been kind of envisioning. That kind of requires not just that you have some vehicles out of the entirety of those that are on the road that are able to communicate with just a couple of, maybe sensors that are out in the world and infrastructure. The whole point is that you're able to reach a critical mass, right? And once you, with more and more and more involvement, with more and more players participating, the scale and range of use cases that become possible just grow and grow and grow. So yeah, just to keep that in mind.
So we don't know what the minimum size is to be viable. We do know that even the biggest companies in the world are too small. Even the biggest companies aren't big enough yet.
And it sounds like there's benefit from just having kind of more than one entity, right? Like to share information and all that.
It really is very similar to the development of the internet. Until there were standards, HTTP, World Wide Web standards, and so on. Really, it was just a fragmentary collection of computers connected by wires. It really wasn't very useful at all.
Yeah, that was kind of my follow-up question. So I was wondering if one day blockchain becomes like normalized, do you think it'll be like a standard way for machines and IoT to communicate amongst each other? Was my question, but sounds like
well, I think it's a great question, and I don't think we've answered it yet, and I'd like to. So I think that distributed ledgers and distributed devices are a marriage made in heaven. Really, blockchain was made for IoT, and it gets back to this thing that Griffin said at the beginning is the fact that anything can have an identity allows it to communicate with anything else when that thing is connected. And when that thing has a little bit of sensing power on its own and a little bit of computing power, right? So you can combine AI and IoT and blockchain. All of a sudden, you have the ability for machines to transact directly with other machines, whether that's vehicles or vehicles with infrastructure or other types of IoT devices. And there's a whole economy that will be built on these machine interactions and transactions. And that's what we think is, and we think it's a multi-trillion-dollar economy that's coming in mobility alone.
That's pretty exciting. Yeah, the good question, Hugo. To that, right? We're talking about what this could look like. Where all these machines are transacting with each other and speaking with each other. What are some of, in your perspective, some of the risks and benefits of using blockchain in a city? Because I'm sure that there are people who aren't a huge fan of all of this information being traded. So how do you think about those risks and benefits?
So I guess back, you guys aren't old enough to remember the early days of the internet, but the early days of the internet was going to be this, this great thing that was going to create a more equal distribution of income, a more equal distribution of access to information, to democratize, social interactions. And what we've seen is that's partly true, but we've also seen the flip side of that coin, where there's a dark side of the internet. There's the internet has ushered in a period when there's been enormous concentrations of wealth and power and information, and where some of those inequalities are built on on asymmetries of information, on the fact that powerful companies who sit aside the data pipes are able to scrape massive amounts of data and then use that data in economic transactions. And so the risk here, of course, is we see right now most of the early players are seeing the bright side of blockchain. We see this as something that is like the early internet, democratizing, potentially equalizing people's access to information, people's access to trusted infrastructure. But there's probably some dark sides of it that we haven't thought of yet, that will only become apparent in hindsight. One of the things that I think that blockchain actually does is it has the opportunity to correct some of the things that were done wrong that led to the negative outcomes in the internet, particularly around identity. I think that the fact that the internet is a distributed network, but that it relied on centralized authorities for identities and trust, right? These certificate authorities, the assigners of internet IDs and server IDs. There's a mixture of centralization and decentralization that led to some of the problems. The fact that blockchains allows everybody to have an identity allows for a lot more trust to be built in, right? Just if you think about the internet traffic today, 60% of it is bots, right? And 60% of that is malicious, right? Identity is a huge problem, and trust and provenance is a huge problem in decentralized networks. So in a sense, blockchain has the potential to fix the original sin of the internet by bringing back the trust and the identity to it.
I think that's a really good point that I didn't think about. Yeah, that's awesome.
Griffin, I just want to know if there's anything you wanted to add to that before we move on to the next question.
No, I think that Chris handled that question pretty well. Yeah.
Thanks,
yeah.
Griffin.
Yeah.
Great teamwork. You mentioned that you've been working on, or you have some working groups rather, and I believe one of them you said was called EVGI, if that's accurate. Can you kind of describe what EVGI is and what that working group's on?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I was the fellow for the EVGI stands for Electric Vehicle Grid Integration, and it's the MOBI working group that is focused entirely on e-mobility applications of blockchain within smart cities. The working group, and I think that we're joined by CK, who is also in the working group. So hello, CK. The working group focused on three main use case areas. The first being vehicle to grid, having the vehicle and the grid systems communicate and share information and coordinate. Peer-to-peer, which focused on ensuring that that energy transactions between peers could happen, as well as was two, and finally three, a tokenized carbon credits. Which looks at the generation of carbon credits and carbon instruments, digitizing them, tokenizing them on the blockchain, and seeing what efficiencies you can create by managing the generation and retiring of those credits using a distributed ledger. So the EVGI working group focused on those three use case areas. Although they did have that focus, I think that the key is that the EVGI standard that resulted from that working group really does prescribe a set of kind of what we call at MOBI core services. These things like identity, but also like access management, like assurance, like whitelisting and blacklisting, things like this, like these necessary functionalities that exist within a distributed system. That was, and those are going to be useful in a many contexts, not just within the context of the integration of vehicle EVs and grid systems, or within the context of electricity transacting or carbon credits. They're useful within really a wide variety of use cases, even outside of e-mobility. Yeah, so that was the EVGI working group. It was chaired by Honda and General Motors with participation from PG&E and quite a few others. Great working group.
And kind of like my own ignorance with some of these, when you talk about electric vehicles talking to the grid and talking to other electric vehicles, what does that mean kind of tactically? Does it mean that they're communicating best times for charging, or is it something completely different?
Well, what that means really varies depending on the application that you're talking about, right? Like, I think for me, one of the most interesting and exciting applications is the idea of using electric vehicles as a power sink in order to assist with load balancing for the grid. Especially, as Chris was discussing earlier, there's been an ongoing decentralization of the energy grid. Whereas 20 years ago, we exclusively had large power plants that generated most of the power on the grid. Now we're starting to see solar panels, solar farms, wind farms, and a lot of micro, smaller scale electricity production, and that varies throughout the day for some reasons. The varies throughout the day depending on the sun for solar availability. Wind conditions change, which changes the amount of production of energy that they create. And so the result is that you kind of have these kind of imbalances of demand and supply distributed geographically. And ideally, it's the grid operator's job to make sure that we don't notice and that that's not a problem. And so far, they've done a really good job at it. But as the years go on, and as we see more and more electric vehicles begin to dominate the world roadways, American roadways, the grid is going to have to contend with far greater demand, and far greater cyclical demand too. Like everyone, they unplug their EV, they drive to work, they come back between 5:30 to 7:30. Everybody's plugging their cars back in. There's this massive spike in demand that occurs. And so there's I think it's very exciting, the possibility of using blockchain to coordinate between the electric vehicles and the grid to have them store some of that power during peak demand and return some of that power during low production. This minimizes the kind of stress and the stress on the grid. It minimizes failures, costly equipment malfunctions, and assists with scaling the grid all the way to the huge amount of demand that we're going to see electric vehicles place on it over the next 10 to 15 years.
Just as an aside, it's not just us talking about this. Stanford's own Stanford Linear Accelerator, has a project on grid resilience and blockchain distributed ledgers. Sandia National Laboratory has a project on blockchain and distributed energy resources, and managing and coordinating. So the Department of Energy is involved. The big national laboratories are involved. This is a cutting edge area of research.
That kind of just sparks a question of, like, do you think this is going to be a public or a private source kind of solving this solution? You mentioned you have a lot of OEMs working with you, but it sounds like there's also an overlap that's occurring on like a government side or with a policy side.
Go ahead, Griffin.
Yeah, I'd say that the key is that getting back to that minimum viable community, we're going to need all of those players, and having more and more of those players only means that the system is going to be capable of more and more exciting use cases. Like, for example, you're certainly going to need the participation of the utilities and the state regulators of those utilities in order to execute a system like this. But you might not need that for, or maybe you might not need, for example, you would. You might not need, for example, the government or state regulatory agencies in order to execute like EV to EV applications that aren't necessarily requiring their stamp of approval or for it to go for any data to be going through their systems. But there's so many exciting applications like load balancing for the grid or like road usage charging or many others that are going to require connecting and interacting with their systems. So again, it gets back to that kind of minimum viable community and this kind of sliding scale of different use cases that become enabled depending on how many parties participate.
So I'm not sure whether you mentioned when you asked about public or private, whether you were getting at the question of information. Is all the information on the network or on the chain public, or is it permissioned and only available to a few? And I think the answer is both. Some information, for example, vehicle IDs. Like a what vehicle, what ID corresponds to what vehicle, right? It's like a license plate. That can be public. Other information about the ownership of a particular car, where that car goes, you wouldn't want to be public. That's personal, private information. The wonderful thing about a blockchain network is you can set up permissions and vary the permissions within the network. And so the owner of the information gets to decide who has the information and who doesn't. And this is very different than the way information sharing works today, where once the information gets out there, kind of everybody has it. The property rights are lost. Where you see this principle applying in kind of a way that I think is a little bit silly is in the space of NFT, non-fungible tokens, where artists are creating digital copies of things, or sports figures are creating digital copies of sports records. All right, it's a digital record, but it's not copyable. So you're able to keep it private, keep it in one ownership.
Yes, we huge fan of Beeple's work on that NFT, that multi-million-dollar I don't know, piece of art, I guess you would call it. And also super interesting I feel like everyone is always talking about, can you get the vehicle to grid integration right? And it really does require cooperation amongst so many different sensors and entities, but really could provide an amazing option. As sun goes down, everyone comes home, you plug in your car, and we don't have enough energy at the time. So it's really cool to see how you are approaching that. I think we're ready to pass it off to our guests for questions. And I know you had another one about information and leakage. Would you like to ask it?
Oh, I thought Chris already answered that question.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, does anyone else have any questions for Chris and Griffin?
Can I ask another question if nobody else wants to start? I'm really curious about this topic. I was just wondering, for like just infrastructure in general, I feel it's very difficult to change in an established or developed economy. For example, I come from Japan, and the infra has been around for many years, and the government, created this a long time ago. So I feel like it might be difficult to implement some of these like fundamental changes versus in a developing economy, for example, like somewhere in Africa. I've seen cases like pilot projects being executed in some African countries because they have fewer policies and fewer restrictions and space to start a new city, etc. So I'm just curious, like, where do you think this would expand?
Yeah, I think the potential is anywhere. Since you mentioned Japan, Japan is actually working on the TODA, and the government in Japan is working on a city called Woven City that's supposed to embody a lot of the, not blockchain specifically, but a lot of the smart city grid integration, vehicle integration, connected vehicle integration ideas. Korea has a similar city. Places like Dubai, Estonia are trying to become the forefront of the adoption of this type of technology. I don't know that you're going to see the kind of thing you saw in Africa and the developing world with the adoption of mobile and cellular technology, where the issue was landlines were very expensive if you didn't have the fixed infrastructure, it was much easier to move to sell. I don't know if there's an analogous leap that can be made over an infrastructure step in smart cities or blockchain. I don't know, Griffin, can you think of anything?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think that the key is that a lot of this infrastructure is digital. You know, the infrastructure that we're talking about, and so there's not necessarily a lot of there are certainly barriers to rolling it out and having it be implemented, but none that would prevent it from being rolled out in a place that already has an established physical infrastructure.
I have a follow-up question.
Wait, I want to answer one aspect of Yuko's question though. There is a huge opportunity for IDs to make a difference in places where people don't have good personal IDs. You know, roughly 2.5 billion people in the world don't have a secure personal ID, right? They can't get passports, but they also, if you don't have a personal ID, you can't have access to a bank account. You can't own property. You can't own a business. And so you're essentially locked into a subsistence economy. Having a secure ID, a way of putting an ID on a chain, is a way of enfranchising, you know, those 2 to 2.5 billion people. So I think there's a great opportunity. It's not necessarily in energy. It's not necessarily in mobility, not necessarily in smart cities, but it's a great blockchain opportunity for identity.
Totally. It's also making headlines in the news these days. CK, looks like you're going to start with the question.
Yeah. First of all, how's it going, Griffin? How's it going, Chris?
Hey, how you doing, CK? Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Same. Kind of along similar lines as Yuko's question. So, kind of being in the blockchain space since about 2017, there's a lot that's happened since then. A lot of advancements, a lot of different projects, even blockchain consensus mechanisms, companies, different things that have happened in the space, and it moves so fast, it's almost impossible to keep up with everything. How do you all try to keep up with the advancements in the space? And I know you guys focus a lot more on like standards and do some things that are actually on the, I guess, actually working with the companies to deploy some stuff. But like, how do you even attempt to keep up with everything going on?
That's a great question. I got involved with blockchain back in 2016, 2017, that same time. And I didn't really know anything about it. I knew a lot. I was surrounded by people that had been, avid Bitcoiners since 2010. I was not that person. And so I had to kind of really quickly try to get up to speed. Blockchain at Berkeley did an excellent job with their educational program. They're absolutely stellar for that. If you guys would like to get just an overview of blockchain generally, you should go on their website and check out some of their stuff. I highly recommend it. But the thing is that blockchain, as it went on, as the hype wave of 2017 gave way to the current hype of 2021 and all the implementation that happened in between and growth that happened in between, the space has grown far, 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 far too quickly for any one person to keep track of everything going on in it. And I had to slowly accept that and give up on knowing everything that was going on and keeping up. So instead, I try to focus. I just try to make sure I'm able to keep track of everything going on in blockchain and mobility and digital identity. And if I'm able to do that, then I'm pretty sure I can do my job. And it's plenty of stuff to keep up with. Just those couple of categories. I don't know about you, Chris.
I don't think it's possible to keep up with all the technical developments or to be an expert in cryptography and game theory economics and everything else that you would need to master the entire space. What I do think is the key to success within MOBI is being able to bring in subject matter experts from companies like CK at PG&E to help us do the hard stuff.
That's awesome. Gentlemen, we wanted to say thank you for your time. We're pushing into this for this evening. This is hugely informative for all of us. Definitely learning a lot by speaking with you. and really, really interesting topic. So definitely wanted to say thank you from everyone at the Energy Club. We appreciate all your time.
Thank you guys for having us. It was great to be able to talk to you all, and thank you so much.
A
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thanks for your time and interest. Bye.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Have a great night.
Bye.
Cheers, guys.